enjoy this while we eat our apple.
The Diablo series has been a staple in my game library for almost 30 years. And over that time, each installment has played a very different role in my gaming history. Diablo 1 was my first time experiencing meaningful character progression and a freely explorable town hub, with memories of my first butcher kill and playing on Battle.net permanently seared into my brain.
Oh yeah.
Its sequel, Diablo 2 and Lord of Destruction, is likely the game that I've spent the most hours playing in my life, outside of World of Warcraft of course, regularly returning to the game every few years since its release. Though Diablo 3 wasn't an ideal successor, partially due to my own expectations, I still have fond memories of smashing my head through Inferno on release, and pursuing build-defining drops, like Greer Falcon's Foot and the Jenkum board. And Diablo 4, despite my sincerest efforts to enjoy it, was one of the least engaging games I've played in recent memory. But the game has some areas of surprisingly strong execution. The music, the art, and some other features are relatively strong. But it embellished some of the features of Diablo 3 that I didn't love, like loot frequency and excessive player power. And it also introduced new designs, like creature scaling and auto navigation.
This is what it looks like.
Which pushed Diablo 4 further away from the gameplay
This
that
looks
defined
so
the
much
series'
better.
roots, and I don't think that's a good thing. Diablo 4 is an important showcase for how strong execution from multiple departments, which can be very difficult to achieve, by the way, can be overridden by foundational design choices to produce a game experience that just feels meaningless. For me, that is. What was a series founded on cautiously exploring dangerous dungeons now features auto-navigation to a map marker on a warp-speed pony. What was once a game with clear progression relative to increasingly challenging creatures now features scaling game systems that produce an effectively flat difficulty curve. Where once there were fewer, more meaningful gear upgrades, there is now a deluge of meaningless upgrades that have little to no functional impact on gameplay. What was once a game where the environment was used to control enemy numbers because of player vulnerability is now about jumping into the middle of large packs of enemies and spamming flashy cooldowns. You get the idea. In this analysis of the Diablo franchise, I'm going to be comparing the systems, features, and campaign experiences of Diablo 1 and 4, dipping into Diablo 2 and 3 occasionally. To help with the understanding...
It really, like, those are already such great things he touched on with it. The auto-scaling, the mass loot just being meaningless. And then I really like how he touched on the combat where in Diablo 1... and even Diablo 2, you want to be like away from the mobs. There's like fear of mobs. But then in 3 and 4, it's literally just jumping right in the center of every single pack and just doing a bunch of cooldown spells.
And appreciation of how much the series' core designs have shifted over the years. We're going to start the retrospective by looking back at Diablo 1 and some of its core designs, touching on what made it great, what were some of its flaws, and most importantly, we'll establish a foundation for our analysis of Diablo 4. In part 2 of this series, we'll start our assessment of Diablo 4. We'll look at how modernizing the series has stripped it of much of the tension and meaningful gameplay that the series has built its name on. And I know that Diablo 4 changes and maybe even improves after you've done the campaign and reached the end game. But we're focusing on the campaign because it's generally the most expensive content to develop, and it's the first X hours of a game that all players have to experience. And yeah, it might be silly to compare two games which were released nearly 30 years apart and are separated by multiple sequels. Game series change over time, sometimes dramatically, and that's okay. D2 and D3 show the design bridges that connect Diablo 1 and Diablo 4. But when someone enjoys playing the original game in a series, for the first time in over 20 years, more than they enjoyed the latest installment, I think it's worth examining why. Is it just nostalgia? Or is there something else going on? What did the developers of each game think made for good combat, quests, loot, exploration, narrative? And how has that perspective changed over time? These are all things we'll explore in this series. But if you enjoy Diablo 4, that's great. Sincerely, I don't think you're wrong for liking it or disagreeing with me on every criticism I make in my design analysis.
A little bit.
This is simply an assessment about how, for my taste, the series has devolved over time. So, come on, join me in an exploration into a franchise that was founded on this and has been modernized into this.
This is just like dopamine! Dopamine!
One of the top-selling PC games of 1997, Diablo is the story of a lone adventurer, unless you're playing online, and their journey through Tristram, attempting to unravel the mysteries about the evil that is afflicting the town and its inhabitants, slaying the avatars of that evil along the way. Diablo is the benchmark against which many future ARPGs were measured, with original reviewers of the title highlighting, quote, elegant simplicity of an action game and the addictive storyline of an adventure game with the personalization and exploration of an old-school RPG, with the review moving on to praise the replayability value and the loot system. With slower-paced gameplay, compared to modern Diablo at least, aspects of resource management, and some of its visual and audio theming reminiscent of a horror game, Diablo is able to impart a feeling of vulnerability on the player.
At least on me.
The player isn't an all-powerful being carving through packs of demons with ease, unless you research game guides. They're an adventurer who often moves slower than their enemies, has limited potions, can be stun-locked, the player doesn't have a 100% chance to hit their enemy, and they're not supported by a generous and automatic checkpoint system. Although these features can certainly be annoying, when they're all taken together, they're able to make moments like this, where you unexpectedly run into a pack of powerful enemies, genuinely tense. And that tension, when combined with resource management, player vulnerability, and atmosphere, makes Diablo occasionally feel like a survival or horror game, instead of a high-action RPG. One of my most vivid memories of gaming as a child was watching my older brother playing through Diablo online with a friend, who was walking him through the game for his first playthrough. When he came across the butcher's room, the nerdy teenager opened the door just for a second to trigger the before slamming the door immediately and then moving on. Despite being highly overgeared for the encounter, the game's systems and atmosphere made that encounter genuinely frightening and intimidating enough to actually avoid for a young teenager.
God, it's so scary.
But even as an adult, playing through the game with some vague memories of its content, it's still able to create some startling, if not tense moments, like the first time I ran into a rhino guy, or this abnormally agile goat. The tension that the game is able to produce was not necessarily because the game is dark and spooky, although it is. There's tension because survival is far from guaranteed. Unlike modern Diablo, encounters aren't necessarily tuned to be survived head-on, so the player needs to find a way to survive them. And things like the player's movement speed, or lack thereof, are important factors in that tension and vulnerability.
Please, no kill.
Diablo limits the player's movement speed to walking, unless you're teleporting. There's no run, there's no rolling or dodging, and it can be frustratingly slow when exploring large areas, backtracking, or returning to town. Though it can be easy to say that movement speed as slow as Diablo 1's is just bad design, it does serve an important gameplay purpose.
Yeah.
To illustrate that, let's have a little look at some survival horrors, action horrors, whatever they're called.
Like Resident Evil 4 or Dead Space. Those games create a lot of their gameplay tension through limiting the player's movement speed and mobility, much like Diablo 1 does. Whereas Diablo 4's combat would look a little bit more like this version of Resident Evil 4. More on that later. By limiting the player's movement speed and introducing features like hit stuns, Diablo 1 is able to create some additional layers of gameplay complexity that wouldn't necessarily be present if the player had higher mobility relative to their enemies.
Exactly, Korean.
This plays a vital role in combat and how the player approaches encounters, especially for melee characters. Many of the creatures in Diablo 1 move as quickly as you do. This makes one consider how you will approach different creature compositions, how you might have to outmaneuver them using the environment, how you can use the environment to limit the number of creatures you're going to fight at one time.
I'm
or
so
how to
sad
corner or cluster
that
them
in
together.
all of the new games,
These are considerations I
environments
rarely
are
found myself
completely
having to make
irrelevant
while playing Diablo 4.
in the combat.
Though the slower speed of movement does introduce some interesting
Diablo 1 and
strategic
Diablo 2,
considerations, it also comes with quite a few
it's
issues.
so important.
The player's
having
movement speed can
doors
put
and
melee
walls
characters
and
at
all
an
this stuff.
extreme disadvantage when fighting ranged enemies,
And then
as the enemies will
D3,
flee from
D4,
melee
PoE,
attacks,
whatever.
but not from ranged
It
attacks.
doesn't matter.
This results in some terribly
Environment is
frustrating,
nothing.
drawn-out encounters comprised of mostly chasing down your target, landing a single hit, if you're lucky, and then chasing them down some more. So there are ways around this, like building a melee character that has enough dexterity to use a bow, or enough magic to use Stone Curse. But because there is no way to reallocate spent stat points, it's impossible to make these pivots later in the game. You have to plan for these diversified builds from the outset of your adventure. And if you didn't, too bad. You're going to be doing a lot of chasing. Diablo's combat has some other contentious features, like chance to hit, which grossly devalues the strength stat. The game also features hit stuns, another system that, while annoying, adds some layers of complexity to the game.
So many games don't have hit stuns now,
you can't always just walk
too.
away from a dangerous encounter in Diablo.
It's awful.
If you're not careful, it's very easy to find yourself getting stun locked or being unable to walk away from an encounter. Some other features, which may be considered unnecessary friction to some modern gamers, include things like item durability, town portal scrolls, item identification scrolls, recovering your body to get your gear back, manually refilling your potion belt, and inventory management.
Literally all things that have been removed in like modern RPGs. Just anything that's difficult. Anything that adds any difficulty, any friction whatsoever is just gone. Like, oh. Durability. You don't like durability? Durability allows for ethereal items to exist in Diablo 2 and all of the really cool things that you get to have with that. Durability is fantastic. And maybe every now and then you got to go back to town to repair. It's like so sad. But I mean, it's so true, but it's so sad. This is all stuff that's like, they remove friction because somebody complains about friction, and they go, if somebody's complaining about friction, they're leaving the game, they're not spending money on a microtransaction. So we need to make it so they stay in the game, no friction, they get to the end, and they spend more money on microtransactions. But then the games all feel the same, and they all
These are systems that the player has to remain mindful of, and have very real implications for gameplay, because poor planning can have some pretty significant outcomes, like being stranded in a dungeon if you don't have any portals, losing all your gear if you can't safely get back to your body in multiplayer, or permanently destroying an important piece of gear due to durability loss. These systems make for planning, strategies, and gameplay that is unique in the context of modern games, and certainly unique compared to modern Diablo. They also help form D1's more expedition-oriented gameplay, where you adventure till you run out of potions, scrolls of town portal, an item needs repairing, or your inventory fills up. At which point you return to town,
can overdo it.
identify items,
Breath of the
repair your
Wild,
gear, stock
a
up on
little
potions and
overdid it on
scrolls,
durability.
and then dive back into the dungeon. Then you repeat this cycle.
But I
over
still
and over.
actually really liked
These
the
systems
idea
make
that
for
they
a
had
starkly
with it.
different experience from Diablo 4's stream.
Like, yes, an item in Breath of the Wild would break after like 4 swings, and it was really annoying. But the idea behind it was that every weapon really had a different style. And so you were constantly having to change up your style, and just, it was very, very much in the theme of the world and the idea that you're just like going around and using whatever you get, and you're fighting and you pick something up and you hit and it breaks and you grab the next thing. And it's like, it's a really cool idea. And it's one of the ones that I complain about. And I do think, again, they could have at least made them last a little longer. But in the end, I like that the devs stuck with their vision of, you're going to constantly be changing every single weapon that you're using all over the place, because this is some friction, but it's our vision, and it creates this new unique experience, right? In so many games, like Diablo 2, I just have my one weapon and that's all I have, and I hit forever and I go back and repair it, and I can always have my best weapon. In this, you don't always have your best weapon. You get your best weapon for a few swings, and then you switch to the next. And so I really ended up loving the vision. The tough part was, if you had to fight, some dude, sometimes you'd go through like 4 weapons on a single guy. And that felt a little bit much.
Streamlined gameplay. But do all these additional, perhaps menial features ultimately make for a good player experience?
That'll
Exactly.
depend on who
can't
you
just
ask.
play one way.
I
So
enjoyed them, but it certainly won't
think
be for
it
everybody.
Really,
Doing things like trying to weapon swap
really
or
was a
refill
great
your
vision
potion
that
belt
was
manually
annoying
while
at
low on
first,
life and being
but-
pursued by enemies can make for some crazy tense gameplay. But I think a lot of modern gamers would find that micromanagement and fiddling in the inventory screen to be abrasive and an artificial modifier to the game's difficulty. That's a pretty easy argument to make, actually. It's fun, but clunky. Modern Diablo has effectively eliminated all of these features to produce
Hey.
a more streamlined experience.
That's what I said.
And if you're trying to adapt the series for mass appeal, this might be one of the approaches that you try to take.
Oh my god, I hate so much these inventories. Every time that I see an inventory like this in a game, I just like vomit. And it's a little sad because Llama RPG's inventory is kind of going to be like that. But it's a different style. That's a turn-based RPG, not an ARPG. But there is some piece of it, but
I think
I still hate it.
Gameplay's super generic.
It
The
does.
resource management systems and expeditionary gameplay loop of Diablo 1 facilitated considerations and decisions that Diablo 4 removes. Now, Diablo 4 features carefully tuned potion drop rates, no item identification, a massive inventory with uniform items, fast movement speed, infinite town portals, removal of chance to hit, removal of hit stuns, and I'm sure there's some other things that I've missed. By stripping out these features, Diablo 4 creates a much simpler, more accessible gameplay loop. But, overall, despite many points of frustration, I found that the aforementioned systems of Diablo 1, which some players might consider friction, to add to my level of mental engagement with the game, ultimately creating a more engrossing and more positive experience for me than Diablo 4's relatively mindless gameplay. But if you want to play a Diablo game that requires a little less mental engagement, fewer systems to manage, and less consequential gameplay, Diablo 4 is probably a better bet. And again, we're just talking about the 35 or so hour campaign experience here. I know that D4's endgame can get pretty twitchy, tense, or whatever you want to call this kind of gameplay. Further contributing to Diablo 1's atmosphere and tension is its method for narrative delivery. When you enter the cathedral, there are no cutscenes, and there are no followers who could provide you with levity or guidance. It's just you exploring and fighting your way through labyrinthian levels, looking for quest objectives or ways to descend deeper into the darkness. The game's narrative is almost entirely delivered through conversations with the townsfolk of Tristram, or the occasional lorebook or conversation with an untrustworthy NPC in the dungeons. But for the vast majority of the time you spend in the dungeons, the narrative doesn't interfere with the flow of gameplay, enabling long stretches of time where you're alone, fighting the evil below Tristram. The game rarely pulls you out of that gameplay loop to deliver narrative.
Yeah,
If the
it's
player
true.
wants greater context for their quests, they can choose to spend time in town talking to the townsfolk about their current objective. You could find out what Jillian thinks about the Halls of the Blind, or what Pepin thinks about it, or what does Ogden think about the Black Mushroom. Sometimes their responses are relevant to your journey, giving you some nice supporting lore for the quest. And sometimes their responses just lend flavor to the world and its inhabitants. But it's the player's choice to seek out this additional narrative detail. Or they can totally ignore it, and only experience the dialogue boxes that come up from turning in a quest, which only happens a few times in the whole game. It's very minimal and unintrusive if the player wants it to be. The wealth of optional quest dialogue and the limited in-dungeon dialogue all support the continuous tension
Those
of the
hydras.
gameplay instead of regularly and mandatorily breaking it up for the sake of story, as Diablo 4 tends to do. I don't know why they chose this direction for Diablo 1's narrative. It might be because it was relatively cheap to implement.
Dude, there is so much annoying like lore in Diablo 4. The amount of times you had to wait for a dude to get to a door to talk about the door and open the door after 20 seconds was like mind-numbing.
Or it might have been their ideal design, regardless of budget. Either way, I think it's an excellent direction for the game. The narrative is there for those who want it, and it maintains gameplay tension. It's great. Blizzard used a very similar narrative delivery for Diablo 2. But D3 and D4 go in quite a different direction for their story delivery, and it's much more intrusive and explicit. We'll talk about this in great detail in the next video.
This is what I call just like wasting my time. And this is why I very much, what I dislike most about D3 and D4. And just, when it's like, it feels like they have no respect for my time and they just want to waste it. And so they put in as many on things that you can't get past, that you have to just sit and wait for them to open the door, wait for them to do their thing, wait for them to walk to the stuff. So much time waste that they add into the game that you feel like I'm just a metric, like how much time can we get him to stay in the game rather than making it fun. Let's just do this. Extend those playtime
And these
hours.
changes might seem like a logical, almost necessary way to modernize Diablo's narrative delivery,
So many of them
but I don't
do
think
it
that's
now.
true. D1 and D2's narrative delivery style, and its relationship to gameplay, are similar to another series, genre, developer library, whatever you'd call From Software's Souls-like games. Both of the early Diablos, and many of From
Hello,
Software...
I have a request. I would like to know more about doors in the MrLlama Holy Adventures. Will she be guided through many and beautiful, shiny yet solemn, variety of doors?
You can go through doors, yes.
Souls-like games feature a narrative hub as a core mechanism for story, and when the player is out in the world, conversations and narrative breaks are present, but they're limited, keeping the gameplay loop and the tension of exploring the world largely unobstructed. And I think it works really well in both Diablo and Souls-like games. These Souls-likes demonstrate how a narrative delivery system similar to the early Diablos, when supported by a Diablo-like gameplay loop, can still work for modern audiences. Again, it's a great model for maintaining tension while exploring and in gameplay, while offering story to those who seek it out. Now, despite the praise I've given Diablo 1, the narrative delivery is certainly imperfect, demonstrated by the town's total lack of reactivity in conversation after you've completed a quest. These quests you're sent on affect all of the townspeople, and the fact that they only comment on your deeds if they assigned the quest to you is kind of weird. Sure, it was Pepin who sent you to clean out the water supply, but all the townfolk benefit from the cleansing. And everyone had something to say about the butcher before I killed it, but nothing to say in response to its death. Even if you're carrying the cleaver around town, they don't care. The storytelling is primitive, and it could be improved, but it's functional, and it serves the gameplay well, which is probably the most important thing. And I think it's preferable to Diablo 4's narrative delivery, which constantly halts gameplay to deliver story.
So
Though I
awful.
truly enjoyed playing through Diablo for the first time in
that's
over
a
20
big
years
mushroom.
so that I could make this video, the game has a lot of gameplay and systems issues. Let's chat about a few of those issues. Though I generally like the game's expeditionary loop, in the endgame, Diablo 1's deep reliance on purchased potions and the power of staff spell charges makes returns to town to restock, recharge, and repair happen a bit too frequently. The game's deep reliance on drinking potions does not synergize well with the manual restocking of your potion belt, and the game's slow movement speed in town, plus the town's physical size, makes that process of restocking, repairing, and recharging somewhat tedious. The game's difficulty curve is inconsistent near the end of the game, ramping up massively in Act 4, requiring up to a dozen casts of a spell to take down a single Lexington steel. And that increased difficulty, when combined with fleeing and teleporting characters, makes pure melee builds pretty frustrating to play. Gear durability can be lost rapidly, which can make an item's destruction feel unfair. Loss of all gear in multiplayer if you can't recover your corpse makes it feel like you're playing on pseudo-hardcore mode. And perhaps most glaringly, the difficulty in Nightmare in Hell ramps up to a point where it is almost unplayable if you don't use a game guide, and melee characters are essentially bricked. It gets super hard. So if you consider beating Nightmare and Hell as truly beating the game's difficulty balance is questionable, to say the least. When played in the context of modern games, Diablo 1 absolutely shows its age. And even for its time, it was far from perfect. but today it's still an enjoyable title. And my enjoyment is, at least partially, directly or indirectly due to some of those aforementioned features which might be considered antiquated, intrusive, or even aversive to many players. And when these features are examined individually, like player hit stuns, slow movement speed, or manually restocking your potion belt, they do sound bad. But when all taken together, they provide the player with a unique, tense, rewarding, though frustrating, game experience, which can easily stand out from a group of modern, generic ARPGs. Frankly, I had a lot of fun playing Diablo.
I don't even think they need to all be together. I think you have to get past the idea of friction being bad, which we've discussed many, many times. That is the biggest issue. You can't say, oh, friction bad. Oh, inventory management is difficult. Let's just remove it. Oh, getting stunned is annoying. Let's just remove it, right? Like, each individual one of those things, they don't even have to be all together. Just every single individual one of those things is good, even in its own way, because it provides a challenge. It provides something that you can then gain skill from. If you can get stunned, now you have to avoid being stunned. If there's inventory management, now you have to think about how you're going to organize your inventory. There's a skill in organizing your inventory. If like literally every single thing has a skill that you can build on top of it. And that's where a lot of fun comes within these games. So when you remove all of that, you're removing all the places for skill to exist. And then the skill is just, can you spam all your buttons really fast?
Diablo 1. And I found it to be more engrossing than the vast majority of games that I've played in the past few years. I was more than happy to immediately replay the game's short, very short, campaign on multiple classes just to experience how they progressed through the game differently. And each time it felt worth it. Because of the random nature of the game's drops, layouts, and quests, and how differently the game's archetypes play, each replay was different enough to remain entertaining. And as someone who has drifted away from playing video games as a hobby over the past decade or so, playing a game that can hold my attention for more than 1 hour is a rare feat. If you're interested in playing Diablo 1, but are a little hesitant about some of the more old-school features, I strongly recommend checking out the Devolution X mod for Diablo 1. It delivers a lot of quality of life changes, like fast walking in town, quickly putting potions into your belt, UI changes, increased resolution and frame rate, variable game speeds, which you can see here, and a ton of other features. But it still largely maintains the core gameplay and makes the game much more accessible. It also has online play, and I had a lot of fun playing online with a friend. Sincerely, check it out. It is lovely. I'm very thankful that it exists.
All right, let's see part
Welcome
2.
back to the modernization of Diablo.
Yep.
A series where we're comparing the systems, features, and campaigns of Diablo 1 and 4 to see how they can produce such remarkably different player experiences, despite both titles being dark ARPGs in the same franchise. We're also looking at how Diablo 4 ultimately made gameplay that felt meaningless to me, and the aspects of the game that contributed to that feeling. Let's start this episode with a brief overview of Diablo 2 and 3 to give us more context for Diablo 4's designs, and then let's dig into Diablo 4. So, how do we get from the flawed but unique Diablo 1 to the more streamlined, story-focused Diablo 4? Well, Diablo 2 and 3 present an obvious progression of the series to a more action-oriented, streamlined experience. In Diablo 2, though you're a more mobile and capable character, new players will likely still feel vulnerable, occasionally, due to the difficulty of some creature packs, relatively punishing death mechanics, limited checkpoints, and limited town portals. Though it has resource management similar to Diablo 1, Diablo 2 simplifies these features just a little bit and introduces a ton of new systems and features, but we're not going to get into that right now. That's a topic for a different discussion. The feeling of vulnerability that was so key to the original Diablo experience was eroded in Diablo 2, and then it was totally vaporized in Diablo 3 through some foundational design decisions discussed in the game's initial announcement.
So cartoon.
The barbarian overcomes his enemies with pure brute force. He's the perfect example of our character design philosophy. There's no such thing as too much power.
This explicit change in direction to intentionally making the player feel overpowered fundamentally altered how the player felt when first going through the world. From a cautious dungeon delver in Diablo 1, to a more capable but still vulnerable adventurer in Diablo 2, to an all-powerful Nephilim in Diablo 3. D3 also removed much of the resource management from previous games. No potion belt, no item durability, scrolls of identification and town portal were now gone, and the inventories were much larger. And some of the features which made players feel vulnerable in the previous games, like player hit stuns, hit recovery times, and block speeds, were removed as well, making packs of enemies less threatening and encouraging a much more aggressive playstyle. Fast forward to Diablo 4, where the tension of the gameplay introduced in Diablo 1, due to resource management, its narrative delivery structure, and player vulnerability, is all but gone. Now, even a magic wielder can jump headfirst into a pack of enemies with little concern for consequences, and then mow them down with ease in a game that seems designed to require minimal cognitive load to play, and to be accessible to a diverse audience of gamers. And making a game accessible is not inherently a bad thing, and it can have great financial outcomes. But in attempting to appeal to the broadest player base possible,
sell a lot.
I feel as though Diablo 4 lost what initially made the series interesting: its wonderful realization of tension in an ARPG package.
The waiting for the
Now that we've
chat.
discussed the player experience from the series' foundation and touched on its progression through the years, let's start digging into Diablo 4, its campaign experience, and if it hasn't become abundantly clear already, why I
video
didn't
edit.
love it. At a foundational level, Diablo 4's core gameplay loop utterly failed to hook me in because of how these features were implemented. Scaling of loot and creatures, loot rarity and frequency, narrative delivery, world design and traversal, and combat. So yeah, pretty much the most important features of the game. Let's start off by looking at Diablo 4's scaling of creatures and loot, which is, in my
hated
opinion,
this.
the game's most glaring and ubiquitous flaw. In Diablo 4, creatures and quests are scaled to your level. So when you're level 38, creatures and quests are scaled to level 38. When you're level 42, they're level 42. There is some nuance here, as there is a minimum creature level for certain areas, and some content is scaled to be above your level for added challenge. Occasionally, I would find the game scaling creatures to my level or below, or one level above me, but I can't find any information on when or where that's a gameplay rule, and it didn't make much of a functional difference in the gameplay challenge anyways. In addition to creatures and quests, gear is also scaled to your level or below so that all drops, assuming they're for your class, are immediately equipable. And generally, the higher your level,
So annoying. All drops are immediately equipable. There's nothing where you find it and you're like, I can't wait to level up a few levels to hit this item. Oh, I should put some extra strength in so I can use these gloves. No. Also, like, look at these items.
the higher the item score of your drops. While there are clear reasons for their use of scaling enemies and items, like player choice and exploration, and multiplayer functionality, I found the scaling to have a significant negative impact on gameplay. Why? Well, I'm glad you asked. Have a significant
Also, look. You have damage per second, your damage per hit, 12% damage to crowd-controlled enemies, 45% overpower damage, 12% vulnerable damage, 14% mastery skill damage, 13% damage to frozen enemies, 12% increased damage for each second you stand still, up to 30%, 7.5% critical strike damage to crowd-controlled enemies.
significant negative impact on gameplay. Why? Well, I'm glad you asked. In my opinion, having clear player progression relative to enemies, and often enemy progression relative to you, is a foundational RPG feature. And
Yeah, D4 items have been reworked since then. Now they're just like D3 items, which also suck in their own way.
something that D4 is sorely missing. What happens in a lot of action RPGs, for example, is that as the player progresses through the game, they get more powerful as they level up, gain new skills, and get better gear. And while that's happening, they're also progressing through the levels of the game, which makes the creatures more and more powerful. Importantly, the creatures' levels are predetermined based on their position in the game and not based on the player's level. We can see this general design in games like Diablo 1, Diablo 2, most successful MMOs, turn-based RPGs like Pokemon, just lots of games that feature any sort of player leveling systems. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
Perhaps most importantly, though the player character and creatures get stronger as the player moves through the game, this increase in power for the respective parties is not precisely synchronized.
Yep.
This allows for plenty of instances where the player is stronger than their immediate foes, or where the player finds themselves considerably weaker than their enemies. For example, a player might level up several times before moving on to the next game level. They feel overpowered based on their current foes, only to be humbled by a boss in the next level. Or the player might find a piece of gear which gives them a huge boost in power, making them considerably stronger than the creatures for a number of levels. Or the player might rush past a bunch of enemies to quickly get to the next level, not leveling up or gaining new gear, and then find themselves to be outmatched by the new level's creatures. Sometimes your power will be well matched with the enemies, and that's great too. Another thing that unscaled systems do is they allow the player to determine the game's level of challenge outside of difficulty settings. If the player wants, they can challenge enemies which are high above their level, but bridge that power gap with player skill. Or they can choose to gather power before they advance to make fights easier. Awesome, player choice. All of these misalignments in power between the player and their enemies, it's a good thing. It's a good, important thing that's vital to a lot of game experiences. When you don't do what Diablo 4 did, and you don't scale creatures to the player's level, you are much more likely to get these misalignments in power. And it's these misalignments that are vital for making the player feel like they're progressing in the game. Sometimes enemies get stronger and you stay the same, making them feel more powerful, imposing, and increasing in relative difficulty. So the player feels like they need to power up before advancing, like when you level up before coming back to fight the Butcher or the Tree Sentinel.
Yeah.
And sometimes you get stronger due to leveling up a few times, getting meaningful loot, or unlocking a new tier of spells, and the enemy's power lags behind for a while, making you feel like you're actually progressing your character's power level. It's a constant, asynchronous dance of power up and catch up between the player and the enemies.
You actually get weaker in Diablo 4 when you level up. If you level and you didn't get like additional gear, that whatever, everything else just gets stronger right around you. So leveling is actually a punishment.
It's beautiful, it's simple, it's nearly ubiquitous, and I believe it's one of the biggest misses of Diablo 4's design.
Massive miss.
Just to wrap that discussion up, for new players, you don't want the game to feature constant and massive imbalances in challenge, which favor either the player or the creatures. That's just bad balancing. But you want to give the player an opportunity to experience imbalances as a way to motivate them to either increase their skill or their power, or to reward them once they have increased their power or their skill. Alright, let's move on.
Traumatization.
Another knock-on effect of this level scaling is that you never feel like you're getting significantly more powerful or having a lasting effect on the world, because everything you fight, even stuff from the start of the game, just scales up to meet you. It doesn't matter if it's a rickety skeleton at the literal place you started the game, or one of Lilith's servants in hell. They're the same challenge. In theory, this keeps more content accessible and meaningful to you for longer, but it also continues that flat curve and compromises feelings of power growth. That criticism could be given to fighting the same creatures on multiple difficulties multiple times in Diablo 1 or 2, and it is a little bit weird to be an ultra-powerful character who just killed Baal, and then you get your ass kicked by a Quillbeast, but because they're on explicitly ascending difficulty settings, it feels a little bit less bothersome to me. Okay, last gripe about level scaling. I promise. If your goal in Diablo 4 is to just beat the campaign, once you've reached the minimum recommended levels for the zones or missions, you truly have no incentive to fight the creatures. If you level up, they will too. If you get a new piece of gear, you'll probably just replace it shortly after. It's way more time efficient to just run past everything. And obviously, that's not a great way to encourage players to engage with your game content. Now, let's talk about loot. Let's chat about how a game's loot drop rates and how frequently the player upgrades their gear, affects gameplay, and how exciting it is to get new loot. Let's just get this out of the way at the start of this section. I think that Diablo 4's loot, during the campaign experience, is extremely uninteresting and unrewarding. The game gives you an overwhelming number of upgrades that have a minute impact on gameplay, making each upgrade feel meaningless and loot overall feel just not exciting. Let's unpack that a bit. In Diablo 4, most creatures are scaled to your level, as is the loot that they drop. So each item you pick up will have a minimum level that is below your character's level. Gear doesn't have stat requirements, and it's also often tailored to your class. So almost every item drop is immediately equipable and has a high chance of being an upgrade. This creates an extremely high frequency of gear replacement as you're moving through the campaign. I have some numbers to back this up. We'll look at that in a few minutes.
Nice.
This results in the player constantly swapping in new pieces of gear that provide a marginal, often unnoticeable effect on gameplay. So how is this different from Diablo 1 and 2's drop and replacement rate, which I quite liked? In Diablo 1 and 2, loot type and item level is determined by the level of the creature, not the player, meaning you won't get higher level loot until you advance through the game levels. All gear has stat and level requirements, so you often have to build your character up to use them, and loot is not tuned to your character, so any item can drop for any class. All these factors contribute to making a much slower rate of gear replacement than Diablo 4.
I think he also misses, and maybe he'll talk about it later, but the fact that early items can have big value later on. Like, I can find some boots at level 20 that I use until I'm level 70, level 80, you know. You can get SOJ really early, and that can be great through the end, right? Like, there's a lot of gear that's great early and late because it's not just item power, right? Like, in Diablo 4, it's just like the bigger item power item is just always better. And there's so much just, you know, more damage, more life, defense, everything on the bigger gear that everything always gets cycled through. There's never a time where keeping something at level, when you're level 50, is better than what you get at 55 or 60, right? It's just like, it's just better. And that's annoying. It sucks. It makes it feel worthless. Like, when I'm playing through and I don't have the max gear, nothing matters because none of that gear will ever be better than what's at the end. And not just what's at the end, but what I'll get in 15 minutes from now. So, like, why? Who cares? Just put it on and then go to the next thing.
Big deal, right? Well, the rate of gear replacement may appear inconsequential to the player's experience, but I think that well-paced gear replacement is vital to creating meaningful loot. And in the Diablo franchise, I found that a slower rate of replacement made gear more exciting and more meaningful than a rapid rate. To illustrate my point, here's a bit of a stupid sports analogy. I've often felt like getting a new piece of gear in Diablo 1 or 2 is like scoring a goal in soccer or football. It doesn't happen all that often, but that makes it more exciting when it does happen, and gear upgrades are more likely to feel impactful because of their infrequency. Whereas getting a new piece of gear in Diablo 4 felt more like scoring a basket in basketball. It's constantly happening throughout the game, so you don't get those jump out of your seat, take off your shirt moments too often. Stupid analogy aside, I wanted to see how different the gear turnover rate was for each Diablo game. So I performed some pseudoscience by playing through D1, 2, 3, and 4, with the same criteria for how long I would play the game, how I would play the game, when I would replace my gear, and when I would start my gameplay timer.
Whoa. Best return subgroup. Start this time to me.
And I'm sure my gear choices aren't perfect, but I think they fairly reflect the decision-making of a player with some experience. So basically, in each game, I spent 2 hours killing creatures, exploring, and following the campaign, and in that time, here's how many upgrades each game gave me. For Diablo 1, I actually did this experiment twice. On my first playthrough, I started my timer when I had this gear, and I found only 5 upgrades. I was a little uncertain if this playthrough was representative of an average gear replacement rate, because of these reasons on screen here. So I decided to do another playthrough as a warrior. Here's my start gear, and I ended up getting 10 upgrades on the warrior versus the sorcerer's 5. In Diablo 2, with an assassin, I started my timer with this gear and acquired 15 upgrades over my 2 hours of playtime. In Diablo 3, I played on a monk on normal difficulty with no Paragon points assigned. I started my timer with this gear, and I upgraded my gear 27 times over those 2 hours. So our trend...
This is really interesting. I wouldn't have thought like upgrades per hour or anything, you know.
Trend of increased gear turnover rate continues. And finally, in Diablo 4, I played on World Tier 2, which was the hardest difficulty available to me. I started my timer with this gear and acquired a lot of gear. A shitload of gear. I upgraded my gear 46 times within my 2-hour time limit.
46 upgrades in 2 hours. Every 3 minutes, less, every 2.5 minutes, you are upgrading a piece of gear. Nothing matters. This is the point. Nothing matters. Why even bother comparing this chest to this chest? It doesn't matter. Plus, green number, good enough for me. I could care less if this has lightning res or shadow res or damage reduction, damage from close enemies. None of it matters because you're changing it in 5 minutes.
So if you weren't paying attention, that brings our total upgrades to be Diablo 1 with a sorcerer, 5 upgrades, Diablo 1 with a warrior, 10 upgrades, Diablo 2 with an assassin, 15 upgrades, Diablo 3 with a monk, 27 upgrades, and Diablo 4 with the sorcerer, 46 upgrades.
That's insane.
Now, there are some huge caveats to these numbers, like the number of kills per minute in each game, how deterministic loot is in each game, choice error on my part, how deep I am into the game, item stats, class-specific drops. And because these are different games, there is an incalculable number of confounding variables between my play sessions. But I think these numbers fairly represent the difference in gameplay. And that difference it's significant. These numbers mean that on average in Diablo 1, I was upgrading a piece of gear every 12 to 24 minutes. And in Diablo 4, I upgraded a piece of gear every 2.6 minutes. That rapid pace of gear replacement has a negative effect on how exciting it is to get upgrades. The more often something happens, the less exciting it is inherently. You know, like scoring in basketball versus scoring in soccer. And I was getting upgrades in D4 all the f***ing time. It felt totally meaningless to equip a new piece of gear.
Yeah.
The only loot that felt like it had functional, tangible impact on gameplay were the unique items, because they altered skills in an obvious way. And that's great. But only one of the 46 items I got during the playthrough were unique. The other 45 just helped me maintain some homeostasis of the game's scaling difficulty. I think that Diablo 4's prioritization of loot quantity over quality is a terrible strategy for getting the player excited about loot. More loot is not better. Interesting, well-paced, and impactful loot is better. And for an example of that, just look back at Diablo 1 or Diablo 2. When you turn over gear less often, upgrades don't need to be some crazy build-defining uniques to be impactful or exciting. They can just be a notable increase in damage output or damage negation, and the player will feel the difference. But when gear is constantly turning over, items need to be much more complex and transformative to gameplay, by altering skills for example, for them to feel impactful. For another example of how simple loot can be exciting, just think of the first time you leveled through a good MMO. You're advancing through a zone, the creatures are increasing in level, and your time to kill with each creature is slowly increasing, until you get a new weapon drop, and then your time to kill decreases notably.
Yeah.
All it is a tangible increase in player damage, but regardless, it feels freaking good.
It really is like you need an item to just feel good. You just want to put an item on and just be like, oh, it feels good. You know, like, yeah, now I feel the power of this item. Even small things like, oh, I got 20 fire res gloves that I shopped in D2. Then when I go out and the fire breathers are breathing on me, I'm not dead instantly. now I actually have a little bit of life left. Like, you
to get
feel
that
it,
new
you
weapon.
notice it.
And a huge part of that is the infrequency of upgrades. Because if it happened all the time, your jumps in power wouldn't be as dramatic or as noticeable. After this little experiment, I felt justified in my original opinion. I find it more meaningful, more exciting, more interesting, more rewarding, just better to have fewer drops that were more impactful on player power versus way more drops with less impact on player power.
Yeah.
And Diablo 4's drop rate, it's too much. Diablo 4 delivers an exhausting number of seemingly meaningless upgrades that have little to no functional impact on gameplay, especially when one considers the scaling of enemy creatures and loot. Next, let's look at the narrative delivery and quest structure of Diablo 4 and compare it to Diablo 1. The delivery of Diablo 4's story, and not necessarily the story itself, was another area of Diablo 4 that I didn't love, especially when you compare it directly to Diablo 1, with both games taking quite a different approach to narrative delivery, how it's integrated into the gameplay, and how that synergy between gameplay and narrative makes the player feel. So how do gameplay and narrative interact differently in these two games? Well, they're very different. Diablo 1's able to communicate a sense of darkness through its gameplay, through its player vulnerability, resource management, that kind of stuff, which the narrative bolsters by largely leaving the core gameplay loop uninterrupted. But there's lots of optional narrative that the player can access in town and in the dungeon, and it will generally reinforce the darkness of the game world established by the gameplay. Conversely, Diablo 4 attempts to tell you how dark the game world is through its narrative by constantly halting gameplay to deliver story beats. The towns and villages also have additional context for quests, but when you combine the constantly halting narrative with low-tension gameplay,
You're
due
just
to excessive
playing a
player
movie.
power, no resource management, generous checkpointing, etc., the game stifles its ability to create a campaign that feels dark. And making a game that felt darker was an important development goal and marketing tool for Diablo 4. Just look at the marketing videos.
We really wanted to return to our darker roots.
The much darker style is very macabre.
It's not for the faint of heart. It's gory and unnerving. It's creepy.
But does that feeling of darkness actually translate to the player? Not for me, it didn't. As a prime example of the tonal misalignment between the narrative moments and the gameplay, look at the Elias boss fight, or probably any boss fight for that matter. The preceding cutscene is dark, violent, and gory. But once the gameplay starts, all that tension melts away as you once again take the reins of your hyper-powerful character, to which Elias is not really a threat, and you proceed to pummel his pale little cheeks. Playing Diablo 4 felt like watching a movie where the protagonists constantly talk about how hopeless everything is and how scared they are, but the audience isn't scared at all. They don't feel any of that tension. And while that's primarily due to the misalignment between the tone of the narrative and how powerful the player is, the way the game delivers its narrative further inhibits its ability to generate tension. Whereas playing Diablo 1 is like watching a movie that focuses less on telling the viewer to be scared and focuses more on actually building that feeling of tension and fear in the viewer. So when we look at Diablo 1 and 4, one makes you feel something through its gameplay, which is bolstered by the narrative, and the other tells you how you should feel through the narrative, but is contradicted by its gameplay. Does that make sense? Whatever, moving on.
That makes sense.
I felt that Diablo 4's narrative delivery demonstrated how bigger budgets don't always result in better features. Sometimes, depending on the game's genre, a more stripped down, implicit delivery of story will be better to support the feel and flow of the game. And sometimes more explicit in-your-face story delivery is better too. To illustrate how Diablo 1 may have actually been a better vehicle for delivering narrative for a dark ARPG, I'm going to compare the quest beats of an early quest in Diablo 1, the Butcher quest, versus Diablo 4's The Knight and the Magpie quest chain. Both are essentially the first non-tutorial quests in their respective games, and I think that they're fair representations of each game's narrative delivery structure. Let's have a little peek at how the story of each quest is delivered to the player, and how that delivery either supports or hinders the gameplay loop and the narrative tone of the game. In Diablo 1, almost all of the quest dialogue is optional, I think, so the player could experience the Butcher quest in some different ways. On one hand, the player could complete the quest by just starting the game, busting right through the town, ignoring all the NPCs, ignore this beautiful puddle of soup on the ground, go down, fight the butcher without any context delivered via the game's characters or interactables. Alternatively, the player can spend time in town talking to each of the townsfolk, familiarizing themselves with the cast they'll be spending their gameplay time with. You can learn if and how the butcher has personally affected each of these characters, giving greater context to the butcher character, but also providing important backstory for the townsfolk, like how the butcher was responsible for snatching Wirt's leg, or how Farnham's substance use stems, at least partially, from his traumatic encounter with the butcher. Once the player enters the cathedral, with as much or as little context on the butcher as they'd like, it's now the player's responsibility to find the butcher. There are no quest markers pointing the player to the butcher's precise location.
Yep.
There's no loading screens or boss arenas separated.
Why does every modern game have to point you exactly where you need to go as well? Like... And the thing is, it's not just that they have to point you exactly where to go. It's that if they didn't point you where to go, it would also suck. Like, Diablo 2 could point you, but without pointing you, it doesn't, like, need to. Like, you still naturally just end up understanding, and it gives you enough context that you figure it out. And many of the other older games that I've played. But in the modern games, if they didn't tell me where to go, I would just be like, bleh.
Him from the surrounding environments, and no characters to hype the butcher up and tell you who you're about to fight. You truly discover the butcher for yourself.
So boring back then.
You know that the butcher is somewhere, but you don't know that he's behind this particular set of doors, despite its bloody contents. And once you open the door, he says his now infamous line, "Fresh meat," and immediately pounces on you. It all plays out pretty organically. You're exploring, you open a door, he attacks you. Once you're able to fry his sweet little tushy, which might take a few tries, you're gifted with some deterministic loot, the powerful yet fragile Butcher's Cleaver, and then you can return back to delve deeper into the dungeon. This all adds up to a quest which actively contributes to the game's tension, lore, and rewards through a simple, compelling, and optional narrative arc. No one forces exposition on you. No one stops you to tell you who you're about to fight and why you should care. You discover the boss with as much or as little context as you want. Even the boss itself is optional. The butcher is just part of the cathedral. He's not waiting at the physical end of the level for you. He's just there, waiting for you to fight him or not, which lends even more suspense and reward to ultimately finding him and defeating him. It's beautiful but imperfect, but most importantly, it serves the gameplay well. Let's compare that Butcher quest from Diablo 1 with Diablo 4's The Knight and the Magpie quest chain, which I'm showing here. While I'm talking about this quest chain, I'm going to keep a tally of the number of times the mission requires you to stop for the game to deliver narrative. Remember, the Butcher never forces you to stop for narrative. This is the first crit path quest you get once you've completed the introductory area. Because it's a continuous chain, it's kind of difficult to determine where the quest chain starts. So I'm just going to start it at the first conversation you have after you've entered the open world, in all likelihood for the first time in the game. Like most of the crit path missions in Diablo 4, it starts off with a conversation leading to a multi-destination quest, which is punctuated by various conversations and cutscenes, which are pretty well executed, with voice acting, animations, and some dynamic camera work.
3 times speed.
Unlike the Butcher quest in Diablo 1, the player's engagement with the narrative is not optional. The quest requires you to wait for animations and to initialize conversations and cutscenes. And this quest requires a lot of narrative interaction, including the introductory conversations. From the start of the quest to killing the boss at the end, the game requires you to stop for cinematic, conversation, or animation 21 times.
Yeah.
Compare that to the Butcher's 0. Just let
21 times. I knew exactly it was going to be at least 20 times. Most of these cutscenes, You cannot skip, by the way. And it's not just even like you can't skip. You have to wait for this person to walk their butt all the way here, turn, say their line.
That sink in for a second. The game stopped me at least 21 times in a quest that took me less than 20 minutes to get from the initializing conversation to the final boss. And boy oh boy, does that constant stopping and starting compromise the game's ability to produce any gameplay tension.
Within 20
Especially when you
minutes.
consider how easy the game is and how inconsequential deaths are. Overall, this narrative delivery structure constructs a dramatically different flow of gameplay than Diablo 1. And sure, Diablo 4 tries to tell a more complex, explicit story than D1. But does that make for a better ARPG experience? More specifically, does that make for a better Diablo experience? I don't think so. But who am I to say what the gameplay identity of Diablo should be? To help illustrate how narrative delivery can compromise game flow, let's apply
Y'all
D4's narrative
D4
delivery to a
slaps.
different franchise. From Software games have a similar narrative delivery structure to the original Diablo, with narrative hubs, relatively uninterrupted exploratory gameplay, lots of optional lore that helps build context. But could you imagine playing through Elden Ring 4? Where you have an NPC follower who, while in the crit path areas, stops you every minute for an obligatory conversation before you're able to continue exploring? It wouldn't really feel like it was in the same franchise as the original Elden Ring, would it? It's such a grossly different style of gameplay. And that's how I feel about D4 versus D1.
Yep.
And yes, Diablo 4 is following a logical progression of narrative delivery that was established in Diablo 3, but that doesn't make it any more fun to play. Speaking of Diablo 3, many of D3 and D4's quest bosses follow a similar structure, with the bosses generally at or near the termination point of the dungeon. They're introduced with a cutscene and are physically isolated from the rest of the space to ensure that their animations, behaviors, and balance are all consistent, which, unfortunately, gives quests a predictable structure. You kinda know what's gonna happen before it happens. An exception to this was D4's use of the Butcher, which has a similar jump scare effect as D1's use of the Butcher. I thought it was great. It was one of the few unexpected moments of gameplay I had in D4, which was legit.
The Butcher in D4 the first time was great. The 15th time when you were just trying to do like leveling and then he kept jumping in the dungeon was like, what a waste. Just annoying.
Legitimately challenging to survive, which was awesome. I liked it, and it showed potential for what D4 could have been with more challenging balance and a less halting narrative. But that's not the reality of the game. D4's tendency to frequently halt the player to deliver
11x
story is
speed.
not isolated to a single quest. It happens throughout pretty much all of the campaign missions. This game requires you to stop and wait a lot.
A lot.
Now, I respect when series try to increase their narrative depth with each new title, but unfortunately, I found Diablo 4 was at its absolute worst when attempting to do more narratively driven missions. Demonstrated quite specifically by the Secrets of Zakarum quest chain, or whatever it's called, I don't know, which is just minutes of watching an NPC do narratively important actions, punctuated by uninteresting exploration and the occasional clicking of objects in a room. There are actually 2 points in this mission where people just tell you to click on stuff while they do the narratively important things. Very riveting. There is a reason why games employ a dynamic camera during conversations, because if the story isn't interesting and the
10x
player has no
speed.
input in it, it can be excruciatingly boring to watch a scene play out in an isometric view.
Again, like I said at the beginning, every bit of this makes you feel like a metric, where the idea is just they're like, I'm going to try and get as much playtime out of you as possible. How can we do that? You have to click every NPC. They're going to take forever to say their things. They're going to move slowly. You have to click on every little thing. It takes 5 seconds for every little thing to do the things.
Now, I don't generally talk to myself when playing games, but this mission elicited a very audible and sincere, holy shit, this is boring, after arriving at my 5th location where I just had to stand and wait while characters talked at me for minutes. This questline was a potent reinforcement for how entertaining it can be to simply venture
10x
deeper into a
speed.
dungeon, trying to find the next level, with your only goal being to kill the big bad boss at the end. Point of clarification for skipping narrative. The player can skip conversations and cutscenes where they lose control of their character, although I still feel that this is a significant distraction from the flow of gameplay. And conversations and animations that occur while you still have control of your character are not skippable, which can be pretty painful to sit through. Wrapping up our discussion of narrative, let's touch on how narrative delivery can compromise the player's connection to the game environments, its towns, settlements, whatever. Because Diablo 4's story is largely delivered through a cast of traveling characters, I rarely found myself retreading to the same spaces multiple times to speak to an individual, like you might find yourself doing in Diablo 1 when you talk to Griswold, or Diablo 2 when you talk to Akara. In Diablo 1, the story is carried by the townspeople who you regularly are forced to interact with. These characters are the ones you're buying and selling items from, using for repairs, identifications, and healing. They're vital for both the story and the gameplay. And in a lot of ways, the story of Diablo 1 is much more intimate because it is their town being affected.
Yeah.
In Diablo 4, the main delivery mechanisms for the story, being Dawnon, Lorath, and Nyrel, are mobile. They'll just meet you at your quest's starting location if they have something to do with it. This ended up limiting the amount of time I spent in each town, ultimately making them feel like tools to support my gameplay needs, versus a village with inhabitants that I cared at least a little bit about. And this compromised my feeling of connection to any of the game's towns or townsfolk. And the game has a bit of a theming issue.
I mean, literally in Diablo 4. And I played 200 hours of Diablo 4. I don't think I can name a single NPC. I don't think I care about a single NPC. I don't care about a single town. I don't remember. I mean, I remember some of the like annoyances of the moving in the town, but I don't remember anything about a town that was unique. And with the map and all the places and locations, I don't like, where's Act 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Like, I don't know. And I was in these towns a lot.
Considering the world is filled with so many horrors, there sure are a lot of totally functional outposts scattered throughout the landscape.
But there's just nothing
For the purposes of
matters.
being more thematically consistent, and to help the players build deeper relationships with settlements and their inhabitants, I think the game would have been better served by having fewer inhabited settlements
dude ripped
with
in half
waypoints
over
just
here,
out
yeah.
in unoccupied space. This would make the world feel more dangerous and might help the player feel more strongly connected to the settlements that are occupied, the people in them, and their stories of survival and hardship. So a little bit closer to something like Diablo 2. Okay, that's it for part 2. Come back for the final part where we explore Diablo 4's difficulty, combat, creatures, world design, and traversal, and compare these designs to those from earlier in the series. Thanks for
Oh, man.
your time. Bye-bye.
Part 3's not out. Well, there's part 1 and 2. Very interesting. I think that was, Peepo clap to Pups up for a very good look and discussion of all the different pieces. I think that's, very accurate and really nails down a lot of the reasoning of why D4 and D3 and many of the games have fallen off in a way, right? Yeah, very, very cool.